Welcome to Creative Culture, a podcast about artists, makers, and other creatives and how these people are pivotal in defining culture. The songs we sing, the paintings we paint, the dances we dance, and the words we write are what make us human, and this shared experience defines our humanity. If you enjoy this exploration of creativity, please consider supporting the show over at patreon.com/creativeculturepod. I'll include a link down in the thing. Your help goes a long way in allowing this podcast to continue. If you sign up now, I'll also send you one of these cool Creative Culture stickers. How about that? You can put it on the cover of your poetry journal and be inspired every day. Finally, if you do feel so inspired, please take a moment to leave a 5-star rating or review wherever you're listening. And if you're watching over on YouTube, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this ever-evolving podcast. Jacqueline Suskin is a prolific poet and writer who has dedicated her entire life to her art. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, and many more publications. She has composed, get this, over 40,000 poems with her ongoing improvisational writing project, Poem Store. The concept here partially involves a typewriter and is pretty amazing. We'll get into this some more. Her work has a strong emphasis on connection and healing with a focus on the beauty of everyday life and the natural world while exploring the human experience and mindfulness. Jacqueline's poetry is meaningful and lyrical and seems to stay well-grounded and accessible. If you're new to poetry or you just haven't taken the time to read any since college, her poetry is a great place to start. You will find it personally enlightening. Since 2009, Jacqueline has been a professional poet and has published 5 books of her work. Her latest book, A Year in Practice, Seasonal Rituals and Prompts to Awaken Cycles of Creative Expression, was just released on December 5th. A Year in Practice is a program of techniques and journaling prompts to guide any creative individual all year long. As a self-proclaimed ecstatic earth worshiper, she looks to the planet for instruction in daily life. In her introduction, she writes, "Art making, like storytelling, poetry, theater, music, filmmaking, drawing, painting, cooking, woodworking, and pottery, helps us remember our capabilities, our origins, our needs, and our responsibilities." I've been really looking forward to talking to Jacqueline because she is the essence of what this podcast is all about. The magic and beauty of not just discovering creativity, but harnessing it in ways that affect lives and perhaps even change the world a little bit. Jacqueline, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you spent some time up in Humboldt County, I saw. That's just north of me.
Oh yeah, the sacred place, the most beautiful place.
That's the redwoods up there are magnificent. It is a special place.
Yeah.
How long were you up there?
I lived up there, I moved up there in 2009 and lived there for a few years. Then I went to LA for 6 years, and then I went back up there for the last few years before moving to Detroit.
Well, that's a pretty big swing from Humboldt County in the redwood forest to LA.
Oh yeah. It was a grand experiment that I just needed to follow, and it worked out. It was great. Yeah.
So you were living in a cabin or something up in Humboldt? I imagine everybody in Humboldt County lives in a cabin for some reason.
Well, I definitely lived in a cabin, yes, for part of my time there. I did some work hosting artist residencies. So I lived in a little cabin and tended the garden out at a residency further inland a little bit. And then this last time that I lived up there, I was on the coast hosting another residency.
I imagine a lot of the people up there enjoy reading Walden. Was that inspirational, or is Walden a little cliched?
Well, no, I think there's much beauty to be found in Walden. Yeah, I don't know if everyone in Humboldt has tapped that, but yes, I love the Walden thread. Definitely runs through a lot of different experiences in my life. That's for sure.
Yeah. Do you read a lot of poetry just
Yeah,
just for
yeah,
fun?
I
Yeah.
do. Yeah. I kind of have this sense of art making in this way where if you're inclined to call yourself a certain type of artist, I would hope that you would want to and be curious about delving further into the craft. And for me, that's always been, exploring other poets' work and even their lives and their practices. Because I think, oh, I'm in this lineage. This is sort of like a ancestor guide here on the page. Or usually when I was younger, I would find in other people's writing that like reflection that I needed to feel like I was seen and heard and understood. And oh, if this really famous, really talented poet is writing things that resonate with me, I'm sort of on the right path here. Like I'm held with these other kindred spirits. So I think still reading poetry does that for me.
I think that's really important for all artists and craftspeople and creative people because it's too easy, especially when you're making a living at it, to just get so focused on your own work that you kind of forget that there's a whole world out there who's doing similar things that you could still grow and learn from. And it's interesting you talk about the lineage of it because poetry is just such an ancient art. I mean, it's even probably even more so than prose or any other form of writing. I think of the history of poetry, and it's something that is just in every culture around the world. Why is poetry like that? Why has this had this hold on humanity?
I kind of think of it as well, language is our special human tool to try to decipher the grand cosmos or things that we don't understand, or even just things that are very everyday. And how do we describe this to others? Language is our main tool. But I do think that poets are the ones who are like, okay, I'm going to use the tool and I'm going to use it to discuss the macro and tie the macro to the micro. So there's this effort being made there to kind of describe this bridge that lives between all things. And I see that as sort of this, it's a craft of language for sure. And it's also sort of you know, a translation of something that maybe gets lost in everyday speech or would be overlooked in prose that's really sort of didactic or like straightforward. And poetry allows for way more exploration. And I think humans have always sort of leaned into like wondering about the spirit of things and wondering about, the pulse that lives beneath the surface. And poetry is just the form of language that allows us to explore that. And so I imagine that that's been just happening throughout all of time. As language has progressed, humans have only wanted to do that more and more and more. So poetry persists.
It's I had a mentor years ago, and he held this belief, and I always have taken this with me through life that poetry is the purest, most honest form of self-expression that exists because it can be completely for the self, whereas prose, other forms of writing, other forms of communication, other forms of art are in a large sense for other people.
Yeah. And I love to think about how we make these decisions where, as any type of artist makes this decision, but as a poet, I choose to craft my language. And I love that you kind of said this in your introduction of just making something very accessible. Because for me, my goal and my choice is to share these private inklings and my, inner examinations with other people. And part of that is because I am a human myself. So I feel like if I'm discovering something, if I'm tapping into the essence of something, or if I'm able to heal and grow by writing poetry or reading poetry, or even just cultivating a poetic mindset, then I'm sort of inclined to share that. And I love the idea of just receiving this kind of private information and then crafting it to share with other people. And I think that, you choose to do that as an artist. You're either going to make your paintings and they're just for you, or you're going to share them with as many people as possible. Or maybe I had a professor in college who was like, it's very important that you choose in your mind, at least, who your audience is, because that'll affect the way that you edit your work. And I
Mm-hmm.
definitely choose to edit my work for as many people as possible so that there's an invitation there for all different types of people to enter that space with me.
So, do you write poetry for strictly yourself too? Poetry that you know will not have any kind of an audience? And is that a whole different way of looking at poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely write for myself. I have journals full of rambles, and I kind of consider the way that that looks for me is my brain is almost always working in a poem, and I can kind of tap into that whenever I want to, and especially because I've cultivated the practice around getting that out of my brain and onto the page. But that I have all these journals full of poems that no one will ever see, and those are definitely just for me. And usually that's honestly coming from a place of me needing to figure something out, or perhaps I'm trying to like reflect on and celebrate something in my life, and the only way I can really do that is to try to put it on the page and see it in that form. That's just what works best for me.
Because I think everybody's personal worldview has value to other people, but and I've written poetry off and on basically my whole life, and personally going through kind of a block right now with it, which we'll have to get into. Um, but how, and this might be part of what I'm going through right now, is how does a person write honestly uh, without feeling or seeming self-indulgent? I guess this is kind of a big topic I have right now.
Hmm. Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by self-indulgent, because sometimes
For
I
the
think
for the
it's nice to be
reader,
self-indulgent. But
well,
you mean for someone else, like someone
I
else who's
think
witnessing it.
that's the thing, because if I
Hmm.
can certainly be as self-indulgent as I want and come off as just so, I don't know, trite or something when I'm just writing to myself.
Hmm.
But if I think somebody's going to be reading this,
Hmm.
I, I'm very self-conscious of about how this reflects on
Hmm.
me, I guess. It's my
Hmm.
own
Hmm.
ego.
Well, I think as the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear that is I have this concept that I've like deeply become acquainted with over the last like 5 years of my practice, which is I like to call it the editing muse. And, there's this muse who arrives in the beginning, the creative muse who gives us the inspiration or the information to translate that we put onto the page, the first idea. And that muse is its own muse. And then when we choose to share whatever it is we're making with someone else, we evoke this other muse, the editing muse. And that muse is maybe not what we first think of or are familiar with even, and maybe a lot of people overlook the power of that muse and how actually creative that space is. And it is different than receiving initial inspiration. It's a different kind of muse. And I've really cultivated kind of a sacred approach in that space. And it's funny because this came through in the poem that I wrote for you, which is this
Mhm.
idea of this like kind of like allowance of that space to be sacred. And maybe there's a ritual there and there's an approach that is with like reverence and awe. It is a little different than what happens when you just receive the exciting bolt of idea that first comes through you that you want to write down. Then when you go back and you're thinking of this thing you're talking about, of how do I, curb this for other people, how do I mold this to invite other people in so that it's not just this like ego trip. And I think that that's
Right.
where I like to call in this other muse who kind of guides this other process of, well, what do I refine here? What do I take away? What about this is actually inviting for other people, and what might prevent them from understanding that first initial feeling that I received? And there's something about that shift that happens when I decide to change what I'm doing in order to share it that just automatically, inherently knocks my ego to the side. Like it's no longer about me. It's about me and this other person. And I can kind of like slip in between that. And I become less focused on this piece of writing, maybe that was just me talking about something for myself. And now I'm going into this whole other realm with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and would you approach that differently if you were writing a poem that's going to appear in a magazine or in a book, differently than a poem you were writing for, say, one person?
Well, yeah, I mean, I write these spontaneous poems. I always think that
Right.
that 40,000 poem number is really funny because all of those poems are like, I have no idea where they are or even what they say. They're all out there in the world. And obviously, I reviewed them in the moment when I wrote them for people with this project with my typewriter. And it's a very one on one experience. And those poems just came right out and I never edited them. But then something that
That's
I'm writing
amazing.
for a book or
Yeah.
a journal or something like that, I'm painstakingly careful with each word. And to me, that's like a glorious aspect of the craft. And it's exactly what I'm talking about, this like difference between the muses and really
I
like,
like that. It's like a
yeah,
three-step process
it
almost you're
is.
going through to
Mm-hmm.
create these poems, and that is part of what I like about writing poetry is the crafting of language and the manipulation of words. And I just love spending even hours on something that is 50 words long.
Yeah. And I just like how you just said that, like this steps, this
Mhm.
process. And that is something I'm really always excited to talk about, which is this idea of like, this is a process. This is something I practice. And whatever these steps are, I make them up. So, I mean, I think that's the most glorious thing about being a human is that we just like get to make up what's meaningful for us. So I just make up these steps and I have this like, the creative muse, the editing muse, and then there's the sharing muse, which is like the outlet at the end where you're guided in where do I give this work? Who's going to receive it? And I've, just kind of made those things up over the years, but that is what works for me, giving myself some parameters in my process. That's always really helpful. And I love to remind people, most artists do that and they get to just choose what that looks like, which is so fun.
So let's get into this poem store business because I think this is the coolest thing ever. And let me briefly describe that it's the way I understand it. This is, I guess, it's really performative. It's a partial performative art, and you're writing poetry out in public. People will come up to you and give you a prompt, and you'll write them a poem on a typewriter. I love the fact that it's on a typewriter. I used to write poetry on a typewriter, and there was something very different about formatting and everything on a
Hmm.
typewriter. And then these people have an individual poem just for them.
Yeah, that I don't keep a copy of.
There's
And
something brilliant about that because it's ephemeral for you at a time in a, well, totally, because it's gone, and yet the people will have this and they will probably keep it forever and remember this one moment in their life that happened. And I think that's a beautiful shared experience.
yeah, it was my only job for 12 years, which is so wild. And that's how there's such a prolific number attached to it because it was a project, it was an experiment that then became my career and led me to many other things, and I feel that what you just said, that there's a connection there that happens between me and the other person that's so rare for a writer to experience, right? Like I'm creating a poem just for them and then I read it to them. They've selected the subject matter and they've watched me make it in real time and then I watch them experience it in real time. So I've seen so many people weep. I've never once sat down to do it without at least one person crying, and there's so much happening there. And then again, back to the ego aspect of it, then I just give it away. So it doesn't have to be about me. I'm not keeping it for, future use. It's literally just for them. And I think there was something about that whole project. I don't really do it anymore. It was like
Mhm.
epically psychic drain. It was really draining.
God, I can imagine.
Yeah, 12 years of, that doing that was enough.
You're basically busking.
Yes, yes, yeah. And now there's tons of people who do it all over the country, which is so cool. And I think it's a beautiful tradition that carries on something far before my time. People poems like you said, are just part of the human experience. And then people in the streets, reciting poetry and sharing poetry is something that's been happening forever. So I think of it as it's an experiment that I took part in that allowed me to further understand the human condition in a way that I would never have gotten access to otherwise. And I think that's deeply affected the way I consider being in service and being connected to community and other people through my work. I have a strong desire, and I always have. I'm an only child, so I've always wanted to just be a hermit. And I love being alone and have spent many times in my life way out in the middle of nowhere by myself, very happily so. But I think because of what I learned while doing Poem Store, I just will never be able to turn fully away from just the importance of being with others and doing something that connects art making to the greater public. And being kind of a bridge between that feels like a deep part of my practice.
What was some of the motivation do you think people have coming up wanting to have a poem written on the fly? I would imagine there was a lot of just kind of intrigue by what is this? Who is this person? Right. And because it feels like these days, poetry is on such a back burner with people. In general, it's become like almost a niche. Well, I guess it's always sort of been a niche, but it feels to be more so now that I don't think a lot of people are considering poetry in their life, other than maybe what they hear in music. But what were some of those interactions like?
Well, so many things come to mind because there were so many. But one of the main things that I noticed was it didn't matter where I was in the country or even in the world, people are always asking for poems about the same things, like either love and a relationship that they're in, or something that they're searching for in their life, or something that they're celebrating in their life, something that they're grieving, something that they're wanting to call in. And I was so I felt this deep, deep appreciation for our level of connection that we don't even notice in life necessarily, we are all the same. We're all going through the same pains. We're all like yearning for the same things. We're grieving the same losses. We're desiring the same things. It was really incredible to see that. And then also, it was sort of a testament to the fact that poetry actually is very present in people's lives. They might not think of it that way. I think the internet and, social media has actually made poetry extremely accessible for people where it wasn't as in the forefront before. Also, our attention spans are so much smaller. So reading a, shorter piece of text, I think that like draws people in. So I think poetry has had some kind of comeback actually, which is really interesting to witness, even if it's just on the internet. People are accessing it in a different way.
Hey, I follow those, daily poems on Instagram
right?
accounts
Yeah.
too, and I love it. You just get that one shot a day, and it's great.
Exactly, like a good hit of something extremely deep that takes you right to the point. A lot of poetry is really esoteric and strange, but a lot of it is also like packing a big punch in a really small space. And I think people need that. We don't have as much time to, sit down and read an entire novel to dig out the nuggets of wisdom. Like, then you read a poem and it's immediately offering that to you. So I do think there's something in that I've seen kind of return to the forefront.
So before this podcast last week, I asked you if you would write me a poem, and kind of on this whole concept of the Poem Store. And so I sent you a prompt, and I haven't heard what you've written. I'm very curious to hear this, but the prompt I gave you, of course, like you were saying, these are all very personal prompts people give you, and probably a lot of themes that you've heard many times before. But the prompt I gave you was just had to do with the struggle of finding authenticity while being vulnerable in my own creativity. How much of my inner self is safe to reveal?
Yeah, I loved the question in the prompt. I love a question, and I began the poem with a question. Here's what I came up with for you. What comes to the surface when we say yes? The inner need, sweet spiral of chaos, dark matter of self exposed. The clue comes when we hear no, that deep resistance that has us wait, linger like leaf not yet ready to fall, wise maple that holds its color until the wind settles the question. What world is ours to reveal? Infinite as the source that suggests melody and meter, this wild situation of satisfaction that only comes with our surrender. And what brings us to this release but reverence, a sacred approach, ritual that gives way to openness, alive as a spark waiting within us all.
Oh my God, that's beautiful.
Thanks. That's for you.
I mean,
there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah.
There really is, but it's so, that is, that kind of hits me at my essence right now, and kind of a lot of what I feel like I'm going through creatively and just in life in general. And that's optimistic.
Yeah, I'm always optimistic.
I mean, in
my poems, I my poems for other people. I mean, I always.
It expresses a certain. It expresses like a personal release and enlightenment from revealing of your inner self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it holds on to something that I come back to a lot when I'm talking about my relationship with my own work, which is this deep trust. Everything kind of revolves around this sense of trust that, like, I have a specific way of talking about writer's block that is a little different than other things I've come across, which I don't know if I even really believe in writer's block. I sort of believe in like more of this rhythm that just happens in life and that it's very natural. I mean, I guess that's kind of a good segue into talking about my book.
Yeah.
But it's just this sense of trusting that there are times in life when I have things to say, and that there's like I was talking about the muse, there's a creative muse presence and that is just pushing through me and I can't resist it. It's just full on flowing. And then there are other times where I adhere more to a practice and I show up at my desk and I just try. And even that feels like maybe I'm not blocked, but I'm not, it's not pouring out of me. And then there are times when I literally have nothing to say, and that is okay. And I just let myself be compassionate with that. And I kind of, I have a big note in front of me on my desk that just says slow. Because for so many years, I'm out there cranking out these poems and I'm having these like deep interactions and writing and making, and it's going so fast. And, now I'm 39 years old and I'm like, okay, can we just slow down and actually let it come as it comes? And I've learned to be much more gentle with myself around these things and kind of just trust instead of telling myself I'm blocked. I'm just like, well, actually, I just maybe have nothing to say right now. And
this is a thing you are just experiencing at the moment, rather than
Exactly.
I think probably the block part comes from a self-imposed pressure that we put on ourselves. Even if it's not a actual deadline, we have to have something. We feel this need, like, well, now I haven't written in a week. Oh, now it's been 2 weeks. And now I'm going to sit down and I'm going to try to write, and nothing happens. And I guess that is the experience. We should just let it happen.
Well, maybe. And then, I mean, I don't think it's that you should do anything. I think it's like you let it happen sometimes. And then I think other times and I'm obsessed with this in my own world of like, there are millions of tools for us to use, millions of countless experiments that other artists have done in their lives and then documented for us. So there's so much resource there for us to pull from. And sometimes that can feel like oh, I'm searching for these prompts and I want help, and that feels exciting and I'm inspired by that. And then I've had other times where I think, no, not even that, actually. I don't want to search for a tool or do any sort of searching. I just want to rest and relax and recline into this moment of pause, because that seems to be what I need. So I think it's sort of differentiating for me between, is this a moment where I'm being asked to examine my practice, to change it, to usher in some other modalities that might help me? Or is this just a time where I can kind of recline and let myself wait it out?
Did you ever experience, and I want to get into your book here in a minute, but when you were writing poems on the fly, was there ever a time where you just like, I got nothing?
There was never a
Or were
time.
you always, where does that come from, where you're able to, I mean, that's a lot of poems.
I
40,000
know.
poems.
I think where that comes from is, especially in this case of what we're talking about, of writing these spontaneous poems for other people,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
I like to attribute a lot of that to the fact that there is another person present who is requesting a poem about something specific. So not only am I feeding off of whatever my own interpretation of that is, but like they are offering up something also. So there's a lot to go off of there. So maybe they say something that I don't necessarily feel some deep resonance with, but I can feel their resonance with it. And that's enough information for me to kind of craft something of meaning, because I can see that as a reflection almost. And I think that's different than
Right.
when you're working by yourself in your own studio trying to uncover some, inspiration, and there's just you. That it's different when there's another person there. So I do attribute a lot of that to that, what that project brought to me in that way.
And so how did you approach the new book, A Year in Practice, and what was your motivation when setting out on this project?
Well, this is my 8th book, and I knew that it's, the publisher, Sounds True, puts out a lot of books that are what I was just talking about, like these toolkits, these like examples of guidance or forms of practice that people can tap into, like different modalities, different things that people are experiencing, experimenting with, and then documenting and sharing, which I deeply appreciate. And to be a part of that, for me, most of my information and guidance comes from the earth. Like you said in the intro, I'm this ecstatic earth worshiper, and the planet is
I like that.
often giving me my leads. The planet is often telling me what to do. And in examining my work as a writer, I was thinking about how often people are searching for a rhythm and a practice that works for them. And there's, I've read beautiful interviews. I mean, the Paris Review puts out all these, examples of different artists' practice, and like looking at their practice and reviewing their daily methods. And, it's really inspiring to experience that. So I was thinking about that in my own life, and just kind of, I've been returning to this idea of that we don't need to reinvent the wheel, that there's a lot of information there for us that we can just use and utilize that's being offered to us. And the earth is constantly offering guidance. So this book is an exploration of how the seasons throughout the year offer this creative cadence, this rhythm for us to follow. And because of the
And
way,
this is for all creatives.
yeah, and I think it's honestly for any person, even if you don't consider yourself an artist, I guarantee you're someone looking for a way to live within a rhythm that works better for you. I think we're all trying to kind of figure out how to balance our lives in that way. And this book definitely just arose from my own exploration of not only how the seasons affect me as a creative writer, but also how they sort of just guide me in many other aspects of my life. And I kind of started to experiment with really looking at that and thinking about it. And then it became very clear to me that it was really having an effect on everyone around me. And everyone I talked to had their own versions and takes on the way the seasons affected them. And there were all these through lines that came through in those conversations. So For the last few years, I've been working on this book, A Year in Practice, and I've been documenting each season and how it affects the way that I move through the world. And I think it's definitely a book of tools and prompts and holistic practices that help people find that for themselves. So it's not a prescriptive book. I mean, there are definitely like things in it that say, you should try this. This might help. This is what works for me. But it's more of like here's a starting place for you to engage in that kind of exploration and for you to figure out how you want to click into that natural cadence that exists for all of us.
Do you see that? Is there a flow between the seasons and how that affects your creative process, or is there just a time when all of a sudden you realize, wow, I really in like winter mode now?
Yeah.
and do you think that is different now that you're living in the Midwest as opposed to here in California, where the seasons aren't quite as dramatic?
Yeah, the book I try to address in the book that feeling of being in somewhere like LA that, you know, lots of people are like, LA doesn't have seasons, but
And it's
as
so not true.
it's not true, and they're just
No,
much more subtle. And I
right.
think that even actually living in a place where they're more subtle causes this need for a closer look, you know, which to me is totally attuned to cultivating a poetic mindset and that observational quality that the artist carries through the world, and having to pay closer attention to notice the seasons in a sensual way is, I think, just even more beneficial. But I actually, when I moved to Detroit, it was perfectly aligned that I would write this book season by season, which I did not plan. It just happened that way. And so I got to write the winter chapter in the winter, and winter is the longest chapter because
Why is that?
for me, I think winter offers the most amount of like depth for self exploration, and not necessarily you're going to finish all your projects during the winter, but that you have the energy of winter is one of rest and reflection. And I think when I allow myself to tap into that, when I allow myself to rest and reflect, that's usually where all of my great ideas come from, in those
Yeah.
spaces of peace or calm. And winter allows me to kind of become that bear in the cave, you know, even if it's just a little bit each day. Because obviously I can't like turn off my entire life and just go live in a cave for 3 months, even though I would probably love
Oh, you
that.
could try.
I would love that. I have done that. I have done that, not in a cave, but in a cabin and, you know, in the desert or in the woods. And
Yeah.
I do. That's when I get my best work done. And I do like to kind of reiterate throughout the book times of the year where I feel like there is a really amazing charge for, you know, being productive, finishing things, and then the difference between that and a period of time like the winter when you might not get things done, but you're cultivating and you're nurturing and you're, you know, tending to these things within yourself and your inner world. And as a creative person, I feel very confident saying that when that world inside myself is tended to, I end up coming to this later where I have a bounty for myself. I have so many ideas, so much subject matter. I just need the time and the space to filter through everything and to calm my mind. And then I find this treasure trove there. So
Yeah.
the winter time is a time where I explore a lot of that.
I feel like winter, and it doesn't matter where you live. To me, one of the most profound parts about winter is just the low angle sun. And I mean, that's a very physical kind of
Mm-hmm.
manifestation, but I think of that as like winter, the days are shorter and the sun is just never all the way there. It almost feels like winter has just a lot of unfinished business to deal with. Like I need this time to really kind of sort my shit out and to figure out what I can do for, and it, you know, there's not a surprise. It's coming to the brand new year is all of this. And so it's like almost winter becomes this time of um, preparing for a rebirth.
Yeah. And I love contrasting that with the summer, which is like high exposure. The sun is high in the sky, and to me the summer is this really like outward time, this very communal time. And you asked before, like this kind of flow between the seasons. Like I think fall and spring are these really kind of intense transitional moments. And this is one thing that I uncovered while making this book that felt really surprising to me, which is spring is kind of the hardest season for me. That return, that, coming back to the surface, that like just the newness of that and the exposure of that is so raw and chaotic and frantic that oftentimes those transitions are kind of difficult. Like, and then fall, which,
because you got to crawl out of that cave.
Yes, exactly. Or you're in fall preparing to crawl into the cave. So there's a lot of like a buildup of energy and you're gathering everything. And, I think when I talk about this book in a really like plain, straightforward way, I think the truth is that there are these natural rhythms that we have forgotten. And my hope with this book is just that it helps us remember them, because they do exist inside of all of us. Like our bodies, our animal bodies carry this rhythm around. And with these rhythms come actual needs and requirements. And oftentimes we forget to focus on that. And then, I notice with myself, with my practice, if I forget, for example, to do the gathering of fall, if I forget to rise to the occasion, if something distracts me from that, then I don't feel as prepared in my winter cocoon. And then I'm sort of lacking my resources there. And I don't feel like going out and doing that in the winter. I don't have the energy for that. And so then I might not tend to those things to the best of my ability if I had like noted the moment where I was receiving all of the energy for gathering my resources, if that makes sense. It's like a reckoning with, if you can follow the lead of things, you'll be better off in the long run.
I think there's a certain anticipation about fall that doesn't exist with the other three seasons, and it's especially winter and summer, which are pretty firmly grounded in like, I don't know, to me we just know what, to me you're spot on with winter. Just becomes this introspective period where I do kind of want to just regroup and just imagine what will be. And fall to me has just such an anticipation of leading up to that. And plus, I just love all of the trappings of fall and the colors and everything that goes along with that. But somehow spring to me, it just holds this odd place of, like you were saying, transition. Because, I'm kind of looking forward to summer, but I also kind of am missing that whole winter experience.
Yeah, it's the hardest season for me, which I don't think I would have fully been comfortable saying that until I explored this book and like really looked at all of this. And I was like, oh yeah, every year I'm like kind of agitated during the spring and I feel really tender and I'm not quite ready to like fully expose myself. So I'm trying to reel myself back into introspection. And it's 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out the door. And that's a very uncomfortable time. But I do think that it's also a really beautiful time that charges you up for creation. I kind of think of spring in two halves. There's like the beginning of spring, which is what I was just describing. And then you kind of get over a hump where everything is out of the ground. The sun is securely in the sky and you're ready. You're joining everything. And there are parts in the book where I talk about these prompts from the planet, which is, just following the lead of what's actually happening around you. Like, what is the earth doing? What are the animals doing? What are the plants doing? You are part of that. So how can you remember that that's also what's happening to you? And what does that information provide you when it comes to, maybe what you think you are capable of, or what you could be exercising in your studio, or what, your life could look like. And I think that readjustment and that recognition of that has been really helpful for me at different points in my life to just remember, oh, right, of course I don't want to go and be with a bunch of people right now. It's only the first week of spring. I'm not even ready for that. I'm not ready. I have to slow down and carefully re-enter the world, because if I don't, I could get frostbitten. I could get, another gust of cold wind could come, or, that metaphorically speaking, I could just be thrown back a little. And I think that noticing that stuff helps me kind of create a better rhythm for myself. And that's what I hope the book does for other people too.
I hope so too, because I think it's becoming more and more difficult for all of us to stay connected with the world at large, as far as, and especially just the changing of the seasons and nature itself, because we spend so much of our lives just really staring at a screen indoors. We're in some sense, we're always kind of in that winter hibernating mode, but without the self-awareness that comes with knowing that that is just one season and that we can move on to the other. So it just becomes this lifetime of just being in our own heads.
Yes, and I think that was beautifully said, and exactly kind of what I hope this book is an antidote for, which is just this idea of this disconnection and our forgetting that we are the earth. You know, this body is the earth. I am the earth, and I can act all day as if I'm not, but I am. And so I think a lot of the discomfort and a lot of the suffering that happens in our lives comes from that disconnection, because our bodies and our minds and our memories, like on a cellular level, they're saying, hey, return to the earth of which you are part of, like reconnect with this place where you were born and what you're made of. And I do think that causes a lot of deep issues, and that if we can find different ways to reacquaint ourselves with that. You know, I do a lot of work in schools and working with children, and watching them tap into their deep emotional language about earth and nature is incredible. It's like, it's just right there. They don't have a lot of access to it on a daily basis. People aren't talking to them about that often, but when they do, their return to it is instantaneous. And to me, that's really hopeful. It's sort of like this gesture of saying, yeah, that exists in all of us. It's right beneath the surface. All we need is the time and space to explore it or remember it. And, you know, just like any relationship, you have to tend to your relationship with the planet. And that's going to require some tools and some different ways in, and some, you know, invitations in which to work on the relationship. So I feel all of my work as a poet is always geared towards that. I'm just trying, even when I was writing poems for people on the street, my thought was, if I can help you remember yourself, if I can help you heal a little or feel a little bit better or feel some connection with another person, then maybe you'll also remember the earth, and you'll remember that you are the earth, and maybe you'll take better care of yourself, and maybe you'll take better care of the earth. And you never know, like, what one little hint of inspiration is going to cause in someone. And so I think just that effort of people kind of picking up a book and being like, I need some help, I need some guidance. To me, that's just so beautiful that's what we're all doing all the time. So making art is just the answer to that. And we're all kind of just answering each other in this reciprocal way.
I think it's easy to become kind of jaded and callous as we get older. Everybody knows this, but it's beautiful to think that you talk to the children, and that's what they're seeing is kind of the nature around them. They haven't experienced, you know, growing up and working down here in Silicon Valley, you know, all day long writing code or something. And I think it's easy to get caught up in that, and you're kind of denying a part of your humanity that is very natural, just to be in touch with the world around us. And is there a way that those kind of workers who are caught up in that, what's the first step? Just get out, take a walk,
go outside. Yeah. Go outside.
Set the phone down.
Go outside. Yeah. Look at the sky. Yeah. Put your feet on the ground.
Simple things. What's the motivation for them to do that? There has to be an internal motivation, though, doesn't it? Because
great question.
Us just saying, yeah, you got to get out and enjoy nature. is meaningless. And they're like, no, man, I'm earning a living here. I
Hmm.
love doing what I'm doing and sitting behind the computer. And not to throw them under the bus or anything, but
No,
I
no,
think
I
there
think
is
it's
this important part of our lives that we need to address.
I think it's different for every person. What you're saying is really true. It's unique to each person, but I think that I was just talking to someone else about this recently of like, there's a reward in it. And what is the reward? And that reward I actually think is somewhat similar for all of us, which is this return to inspiration, this return to a sense of like vitality. And what happens for each person when they return to that is different. Maybe these people would like to see that correlate with their productivity or their, what happens in their job space. And I think that that's viable. I think that's real. But I think for everyone, the reward of reconnecting with the earth is this sense of, wholeness and this sense of connection and this sense of feeling better. And whatever comes from that for each person is unique. But I do think that the reward is what should be focused on. And I think that's the idea too of picking up a book like this and reading a book like this. Like there's going to be some treasure at the end. There's going to be some reward, especially a book that's just saying, here are some prompts and ideas to send you through this journey in yourself. And what you will discover will be very rewarding. And I think that that kind of actually resonates with any type of person and that everyone is
Absolutely.
looking for some kind of reward. So something
Yeah.
like that, I think, is the answer to it.
How can somebody who just is not, maybe they're the type of person who's just read some poetry in college or something because maybe they had a class that they were required to or something. Maybe they even enjoyed it at the time. But how can a person who's just been away from the poetry scene for a while, what's a good way to approach poetry for just a newbie, somebody who's just not familiar with poetry? Because I think a lot of people are kind of intimidated by poetry.
Yeah, they are. And I do think that sometimes it's the way it's taught in school. And what I always like to say, I like to give this example of what I say to my mom, who is not a poetry person, is not, studied in that world. She will read a poem and I'll say, okay, just when you read this, is there anything that you see? Is there an image that comes to your mind? Is there a memory
Yes.
that comes to your mind? Is there a color? Is there some way that your senses are enlivened? What happens to you during the poem? Does any line in the poem bring up anything like that? And she'll say, oh, yeah, well, this part, reminded me of this, or, oh, I saw this image here, or I had this, visceral feeling here. And then I'll just say, that's it. That's what the poem is. It's not something else that's more that you are not enough if you don't understand. It's just that. It's whatever it offers to you. Maybe the poet had some grand intention, but the truth is that they're not in the room with you. It's just their words on the
Right.
page. And I think like taking off that intense idea that we have to understand exactly what this poet meant,
Yeah.
because that's what we're
Aren't
taught
we
in
kind of,
school. We're like,
that's
you have,
exactly what we're taught.
yeah.
We're given a poem, maybe a very old poem, and we're
Mm-hmm.
taught to interpret it. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that that's the point of poetry
Mm-mm.
at all, is to interpret it, because it puts so much pressure on the reader to understand what was in the mind of the
Mm-hmm.
writer. And I don't think that that's as relevant as, like you were saying, just find those parts that resonate with you. It could be just one line. It could
Mm-hmm.
be the wordplay of a few words that are amusing, or just even in some way enlightening. But that's enough.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it.
Should people try to write poetry?
Oh, yeah. I think, my last book that came out is called Every Day is a Poem, and it's all about kind of how to engage with either writing poetry or kind of what I was talking about before, cultivating a poetic mindset, like trying to see the world as a poet sees the world. And I think an attempt to engage with poetry and write poetry can be incredibly healing. It's a way to
It's liberating.
express, yeah, you're expressing something that you might not either express in normal conversation or you might not know how to write about with any kind of normal language. But if you can get figurative with it, if you can compare what you're feeling to something else, it can help you kind of have a distance and a closeness to it at the same time, which I think is something really magical about what poetry does. It separates itself by comparing something to something else, but then in that also ties you closer to it. And I think that when you do that for yourself, number one, you're not as worried about if it's cliche or if it makes sense. That's my journals are full of nonsense. You know, I'm not making sense to myself all the time, but I am allowing myself to try to express whatever feeling is happening inside of me. And just that release alone is worth the effort. I think there's just so many ways that we try to find relief, and that poetry is actually extremely relieving. And even just an attempt to try to say, like, this is what I appreciate about life, or this is what hurts me in life, just helps it kind of get out of your system. It's almost like this
Just
flushing of the mind. Yeah.
Yeah, writing it down makes it somehow so much more different and impactful than just thinking about what your experiences are. But when you actually put that on paper, it holds a special weight.
Yeah, and then I always tell people to read it out loud. That really changes the whole story. If you read your poem out loud, it's like a spell or like a prayer or a mantra or something, like hearing your own voice say what you need to say to yourself, to the world, to another person, whatever it is so powerful. I always try to help with that aspect of things. I mean, it is an oral tradition, so it's very close to song. So saying a poem out loud I think has a real potent magic to it.
What would be a couple of tips for somebody who's never written a single poem and just wants to sit down and write?
Well, you can read my book, Every Day is a Poem. And I think one of the places to start is with your senses. I usually guide people into writing through their senses. So kind of thinking about each one of your senses, looking around you, choosing an object in the room you're in to write about, keeping it really simple like that, and just seeing what comes up. Like, I look at this object. Does it affect any of my senses? Where did I get it? Is there a memory attached? How can I describe the color? How could I compare it to something else? And that's kind of a cool entry point that it allows you to be creative, but also not have to be like extremely emotional and personal right off the bat. I think like choosing an object is sometimes a helpful way to soften the entry point.
And at what point should they show their poem to somebody else?
Well, I think when they feel like it. I mean, I think it depends on who you're showing it to. It's
kind of a big step, though.
It's a big step. And I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a necessary step. I do think there's a whole chapter in Every Day as a Poem that's about sharing your work and like what that does for you as the writer and what it's kind of suggesting for other people. And how I do think that there is a sacredness in that sharing, and that a lot of art is about sharing. So kind of gearing yourself up for that and feeling like you're ready to share. I think there should be an immense amount of preparation before that, just so you can feel like this is the thing I want to show. And I'm sure about that. And I've worked on it carefully, and I've thought about why I want to share it and what I need in response, or just show it to somebody who you feel really safe with. And none of that stuff necessarily matters.
Yeah, because I think there's a hesitation sometimes, like, what will the response be? Will they just have this completely different take on what I wrote? And yeah, I don't know. We overthink these things sometimes, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think after thousands of years of poetry, and it's kind of like what we've touched on before, what is it about poetry why does the world need poetry? Why does the world need poetry now more than ever?
Well, I think in this moment on our grand human timeline, I touched on this a little before, this sense of needing depth and clarity. People are just hungry for an answer that is beyond the surface. There's a lot of surface level conversation. There's a lot of space
There's so much
for
noise,
reactionary behavior. And I don't think a poem is where that lives. A poem is careful and considered. It is not reactionary. Even in a moment where I'm writing a poem spontaneously for someone, I'm not having a reaction. I'm having a conversation. There's something deep there. And I think that people are really hungry for that. And poetry is constantly, consistently offering something of deep substance, but like I said before, in a condensed space. So there's time there for you. It's not a long endeavor to find the answer. It's not you sifting through pages and pages and pages of story to understand. Although I do love doing that also, but I think it's, there's something about this fact that people need it quicker. There's a sense of urgency. And I think that sense of urgency is, attached to reality. There's a lot of things happening right now to spark us with a sense of urgency. And I do think poetry is this kind of faster response. And I really think there's a lot of value in that, because when people are searching and looking and lost, and they turn to a poem and they're instantly finding resonance there, that is just so helpful to hold them in the moment and give them a sense of connection, and that can be something that just keeps them going.
And that right there is a compelling enough reason to just go out and read a poem today. I think you'll enjoy it. Jacqueline, it was great having you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It was great talking with you.